Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about smart defense. In this chapter I would like to move away a little from the previous situations that we were looking at when our king was always in some kind of danger, while here we will focus more on material-based defensive situations, so to speak, when one of our pawns or pieces is being attacked. So smart defense, what does that mean? In my way of seeing things, that's when we are facing a threat. For example, one of our pawns is being attacked and we don't move that pawn and also we don't defend it. We rely on some other solution where we actually allow our opponent to carry out their threat because we have prepared some kind of rejoinder. So this is like an indirect defense, which could be compared to a more mechanic defense, where we would, for example, move the pawn that our opponent is attacking. I think that once we look at the examples, you will have a clearer picture of the kind of play that I'm referring to. I would like to show you in this chapter some examples from the middle game, then a few examples from the opening, and finally a few examples from the endgame as well, because this kind of thinking, smart defense, you can use it basically at any moment of your game. So let's have a look at our first example. We have quite a number of examples here. Let's start with number one. In this game with the white pieces Li Ruifeng and playing black Sevian, we can see that we have some kind of London middle game here, London structure. White has just played queen to h4. They have just played here queen e4 to h4. As you can see, there is the threat of bishop takes h6. So if we apply, what could I say, a mechanical, a typical normal defense here, we would play something like, let's say, king a7. In this way, we are protecting the pawn on h6. But Sevian didn't play like that. I think simply he didn't like the idea that white could play knight e5 check at some moment. On the other hand, we could also say that, all right, we don't want to defend that pawn, we will move it instead. We could play something like h5. But in this case, perhaps white could play at some point the same move, knight g5, and there would even be some idea at some point, not now perhaps, since the queen is targeting the knight on f3, but maybe later white could consider a move like g4. So it's nicer for black if they could keep the pawn on h6, so that actually this pawn denies white of the g5 square. But as you can see, black has a choice here. They could defend the pawn, they could actually move the pawn. g5 is another move that they could play, but not so nice, no? I would move my queen to g3, for example, and try to push h4 and open up the king side. So there are a number of choices for black here, but in the game, Sevian opts for a typical smart defense. What do you think he played? Well, I can give you a hint. It's not a move with any of the pieces which is located on the king side. All right? You got it. He played here the nice move, knight e7. So maybe you would think this is some kind of trick. They're playing for a trick. They want white to take on h6 so that they will play knight f5. And that's indeed the whole idea behind the move knight e7. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not really playing for tricks. It's rather a very useful move, knight e7, because black keeps complete flexibility here. They don't commit any of these pawns. And at the same time, they add some extra ideas to their position, such as, for example, playing knight f5. So it's like an extra touch that you can add to your game. The smart defense, it might not be strictly necessary. It's not the only move, so to speak, but it can be the best choice, if you see what I mean. So here at this point, let's see very quickly what happened in the game. White continued with queen f4, and Sevian at this point relied on the plan which is typical in this London structure. He played here the move b5. By the way, I like myself to play this kind of structure where you delay the move d5. I like this very much. I mean, speaking off topic completely, this idea of not playing d5, because in that case we can use this square on d5 as a base for our pieces. So this is actually how, in my case, I like to reply to the London in this kind of situation with the pawns on d6 and e6. Anyway, what happened in the game? Knight h2. White is trying to perhaps bring the knight to g4 and create some activity, but Sevian hurried on here to carry out the minority attack b4. Very good move, because you can see that no matter how white reacts, there will be some kind of weakness emerging in their camp. This is a typical way in which the minority attack works. The minority advances and there is a pawn trade, and after that the other side, the opponent ends up with a weakness either on d4 or on c3. In this game, white took on b4, c takes b4. If they hadn't done that, well, black would take on c3, fixing a weakness on the same square on c3. So c takes b4 was played in the game. There was knight f5 hitting the pawn on d4. At this point, white simply retreated with the knight so as to secure the weak pawn on d4, and here Sevjan played queen d5. You can see that black is now targeting the pawn on a2, and at the same time the pawn on d4 has become a big weakness. We could even consider something like rook c4 later on to target this pawn if we don't want to take it straight away. Maybe there is some issue with the pawn on h6, so it's better perhaps to wait a little taking it. So this is how the game went. Later on it was a draw, but safe to say black has a very good game here. What I wanted to show you here in the first place was that whenever your opponent carries out a threat like this, queen h4, targeting the pawn on h6, we should not restrict ourselves to just mechanical defensive moves such as king h7 or h5 or g5. We could look a little beyond those moves, look for a more refined solution, a more advanced solution, like in this case the clever retreating move knight e7, aiming for f5. White cannot take on h6 because then they face this very important fork right against the queen and bishop. So that's the point here. You can see the fork is in this case the tactical motive used within the smart defense, but we can use any tactical motives, as you will see in the next examples here. Let's go to our next example in this Caro-Kann battle between Handke with white and Sargsyan playing black. Yeah, you can quickly see that this is a Caro-Kann by the placement of these pawns on h5, h6, the classical Caro-Kann. Interesting battle. You can see that white has, strictly speaking, a better pawn structure because black has taken e takes f5. This pawn is a little weak. At the same time, black has nice central control. The knight on e4 is very strong. At this point, you can see that the pawn on f5 is hanging. So what do you think? How should we defend this pawn? Should we just retreat the knight to d6? Our proud central knight has to retreat? Or is there some smarter way of defending that pawn on f5? What do you think? That's right. We can rely this time on a different tactical motive. We can rely on a discovered attack. We can play here the move queen d5. This is what Sargsyan played in the game. We can see the obvious point here. If white takes on f5 with a knight, then we take on d2 and we win the queen, right? On the other hand, if white takes on f5 with the queen instead, then we could take on d4. And in this way, we create some pressure at white's camp. You can see that the bishop is currently pinned along the d file. So why then play this move queen d5? Why don't you take the pawn straight away on d4, you might say? We could do it already here, right? Of course, you know the answer yourself. We're talking flexibility again. Now, since white didn't yet take on f5, now they can take on f5, but with a knight, which will be slightly annoying for us. Now the knight is very strong here, so that's like clever thinking by black here. They first play queen d5 to see what's white's next move, and depending on that, they will take their next step here. Just for the record, you could indeed play also knight d6. It's the move that I told you that we didn't like to play, but theoretically it's possible. However, after bishop b4, white would have some pressure again at black's camp, and the pawn would be still somewhat weak. So much nicer what Sargsyan played in the game, queen d5. Let's see very quickly what happened here in this game. White continued bishop e1, safeguarding the bishop, and black simply brought the rook to the e file, rook fe8. You can see that also now white must be careful. Now they can definitely not take the pawn, I think, on f5, because in that case we would have this resource with knight c3 check and rook takes e2, another discover. Oh, sorry, they will take with the bishop, of course, but still it doesn't change too much the situation, right? We would give check and we would take on e2, we would win the exchange in this case. So that's what happens here. Blacks relying on tactical ideas in order to improve their position. Now rook fe8, very clever move, taking control of the open file. And what black would like to do here later perhaps is to double up the rooks on the e file. White played at this point the move rook e3, safeguarding the rook and also the queen. And here something interesting happened, which is not exactly connected to our topic, but still I would like to highlight it, because what black did here, we talked about this in the very beginning, that the pawn on f5, it's not the best pawn exactly that black has. They found a way to trade this pawn for a white pawn. So how do you think they did that? Aha, you're right. They played here f4. Very clever, because after queen takes f4, now we're ready to take on h5 instead. And this is a nice business for black, because that h-pawn, which is good in the endgame and so on, it's now off the board, and we don't have the problem with the f5 pawn anymore, our weak pawn. You can see that there are some tactics here. Queen takes d1 is a threat, g5 is another threat, so white has some problems here still. Interesting example, no? They were attacking our pawn. We didn't bother to defend it in the traditional way. We went for a smart defense instead. Queen d5, very clever, so that knight takes f5 is impossible due to knight takes d2. Clever thinking here by Sargsyan. Let's take our next example. Here we saw the topic of the discovered attack. Now we're back to the fork again. I wanted to show you this example, which I think it's really nice. Playing white is Moskalenko and playing black Luis Rojas. You can see that it's Benoni, most probably. White has taken this pawn on d6 earlier on in the game, and at this point, after the move rook f3, f4, white is trying to get rid of black's rook along the fourth rank. Obviously, what white prepared here, what Moskalenko prepared is after queen takes d6, they would take on e4. So what do you think black should do about this? Should we just take on f4? That would be like the normal solution here, right? Just take, and then we'll see what we will do. Well, we shouldn't do that, because if we take on f4, they will take back with the bishop, and you can see that d6 is coming up. That's why it's key plan here, push the passed pawn. At the same time, we cannot really take this pawn, because then we would run into this pin along the d file. So can you think of some smarter defense? Is it even possible to give away that rook on e4, just for the moment? Yeah, there is. Rojas found a very nice move here. I think it's very pretty. I guess you found it too, right? Aha, knight e8. That's a pretty move. Not exactly the first thing that you would notice, right? Knight e8, you can only find this move if you have nice tactical vision and you're able to think outside the box, so to speak. Look beyond what's evident here. So what's the point of this? Well, after rook takes e4, knight takes d6, you can see that black right now, they're exchanged down, but they have this fork coming up, and they will combine it with a trapped piece motive here, because if white really wants to keep on defending the bishop, they will have to play something like rook to this side. But as you can see, there are problems with these moves. No, rook h4, for starters, there is knight f5. If you play rook g4, you can bet that black will play f5, and after rook f4, g5, actually the rook is, I was going to say trapped, but it's not trapped. It's not about the trap. It's actually about deflection here, right? We are deflecting the rook. So that's the tactical motive involved here. Yeah, I was wrong. So that's what's happening here. If white tries to keep everything defended, the same would happen if they go to h4. We would just play g5 in this case, I was going to say, but according to my notes, we shouldn't do that. Well, let's see. Probably because they have rook g4, and if f5, there is rook takes g5. Maybe, I'm not completely sure. There is knight e4 and things get very complex. So probably this might also work, the move g5. But what I was going to say was that we have knight f5 here, getting back the material. So it's difficult for white. It's difficult for them to keep the material balance here. In the game, Moskalenko simply played queen d3, acknowledging that black's plan had worked out well. So black is getting back to material now. Black quickly took on e4. You can see that in this kind of position, it's important not to allow this move. Black first play here the move f5. You can see that the pawn on b2 is now targeted also. And after queen e2, black simply played here bishop d4 check, followed by queen d6. And I was going to say, but actually they put the queen on f6 instead. Yeah, that's probably smarter, because they're putting some pressure on the pawn on b2. Black had the better of it here. You can see that black's bishop is much more powerful than white's. Whenever you have these kind of middle games with obstacle bishops, it's important to see who has the best diagonal, right? And it's easy to see that black's diagonal is much better than white's, which is blocked by this pawn. So that's what happened in the game. Let's do this in slow motion. Let's see what happened here. White had played rook f4, offering the trade of rooks. They would like to trade it off so that they're able to push the pawn. This is the key plan for white here. However, black noticed a very nice, you could say, smart defense here. They played the move knight e8. Completely unexpected move, knight e8. So that after rook takes e4, they would go knight takes d6. White has troubles keeping things under control here. If they move the rook that way, we were saying that knight f5 is very strong. If they move the rook to f4 or g4, on the other hand, the black pawns will eventually deflect white's rook from the defense of the bishop. So in the end, white will have to play here something like in the game queen d3, and after that black will just take back and they will have a nice game here with f5. They have the better bishop now. So very clever thinking here by Rojas in this game. Let's continue. Our next example, it's a little about the pin. Let's see what we have here in a typical Sicilian battle, you could say. In this game between Oniszuk with white and Can with the black pieces, you can see that it's a normal Sicilian battle. Nothing is really going on. Black decided that at this point they would play for the initiative, and they played the move e5. This move itself, it's not really connected to defense in any way, but the next move indeed is, because white replied to e5 with knight b5. And as you can see now, we have the threat of taking the pawn on d6, especially taking with the queen. But black noticed that if queen takes is possible, knight takes is not possible, because in that case, that would be a pinning situation along the d file. So what they did here, they played a very clever move, making it impossible for white to take on d6 with the queen. I mean, the typical, like, what would you say, mechanical defense would be something like rook fd8. You could probably play something like that, but white's plan might have been here to play c4, setting up some kind of Maroczy structure, you could say. They would have a firm grip on the position here. So in the game, Can didn't want to allow this, and he played here smart defense. Aha, you got it. He played here the nice move a6. This is definitely a pattern to remember, especially if you're a Sicilian player. So what's going on here is that, of course, they cannot take with the queen this time, because we take their knight. Our queen is protected by our knight, so to speak. So if they take with the knight on d6, that's of course not possible. We would then win a piece here thanks to the pin along the d file. So after the move a6, unfortunately here Oniszuk had to go back with the knight. That was probably not his plan. He has some ideas now with improving the knight like that, but it takes a long time, and black is already ready to take the initiative here. They played here the move f5. Very nice. You can see that this makes perfect sense when white's knight is a little far away from the battle for the center. So now definitely black has the initiative. Let's see very quickly what happened here. E takes f5, black took with the queen, so that the pawn on f2 is being attacked. White played rook f1. They could also play bishop e3, but black could react in the same way. What did they do here? First, take on g2. Black is very happy to trade off white's fianchetto bishop. I would say that's a general rule. If you can trade off your opponent's fianchetto bishop on the king side, if they have castled short, this means that you have increased attacking possibilities. King takes d2 and queen f7. That's an interesting move. Actually, in the game, he didn't play that. The game instead followed queen e4, and after king g1, black played queen c6. This was the way in which black secured this pawn. They had a very nice game, and they went on to win. You can see that the queen is excellently placed on this diagonal. But I wanted to show you that it's also possible to apply smart defense even in this position, because in the game, black secures the pawn in this way. But we could actually play queen f7 instead. Queen f7 with a simple idea that we would like to push d5. So what about the pawn, you might say? What happens if white then takes the pawn? Well, I think you can figure out yourself what would be the problem with this move. How would black continue here? That's correct. There is always some kind of tactical motive that we have to look into. Of course, we can see that there is a fork on b3, but there is a much more powerful idea here. Exactly. White's queen is short of space. The only square it's left right now, it's c6. So before we hunt the queen, we should make sure that the queen cannot escape. How can we do that? We can use an intermediate check, queen b7 check, and after white moves the king, we can safely hunt the queen. It would not have any squares. So that would be another move here, queen f7. Please notice again the idea of smart defense as opposed to the previous ideas that we studied, such as the king move, making space and so on. This is more optional. We're not forced to use the smart defense. It's just like an extra feature that we can consider. In the game, black played queen e4, queen c6, and won anyway. It's just me saying that queen f7 might be even more powerful if we leave this pawn unattended for a short while. Nothing will happen and we're ready to push d5. But these are small details. What I want to show you in the very beginning here was that after e5, knight b5, we have no reason to restrict ourselves to moves that protect this pawn on d6. We should have a more open mind. We can actually invite them to take that pawn, as long as it is with a knight, of course. So for that reason, we should play here h6, since they can actually not take the pawn. Similar to the first example where Savian invited his opponent to take the pawn on h6 because he knew that he had his fork on f5. So that's how smart defense works. Let's continue. Our next example, my famous countryman Ulf Andersson playing with the white pieces. As you can see, at this point, there is the threat of queen takes b2, playing white Andersson and black Gdansky, Polish grandmaster. What do you think white should do about this threat? What should we do about the b2 pawn? Well, since we're in the smart defense chapter, you already know that the right move is probably not rook p1, right? We should look for a more refined defense. And that's what Andersson did in the game. He noticed that under some circumstances, taking this pawn on b2, I mean, this happens a lot in many openings, by the way. Under some circumstances, it can be very dangerous to take that pawn. We should just make sure that once black's queen takes that pawn, we can trap it. So how do you think we could arrange that? You got it. We cannot really trap it in this way. It will always have a escape square on a3 or perhaps c3. But if we use the other rook, we can indeed trap it. So that's what Ulf Andersson noticed. He played here the move rook e3. Very clever. Please notice that the move knight takes g6, it can wait. We better keep the knight there. Flexibility thinking. Ulf has always been great in this field. Also, he knows that keeping the knight here, among other things, avoids knight d7. It doesn't let black develop the knight to where they would like to develop it. So rook e3 was played here. You can see that the concrete tactical point is that queen takes b2 fails instantly, not to rook b3, because then we're hanging the pawn. Now the time is right to take, so that we can take, we can play rook b3 next turn, and we have managed to trap black's queen. So the trapped piece motive, you can say, is involved here after the move rook e3. What happened in the game? Black played queen d6 instead. And here something very interesting happened, because Ulf is known for not liking so much weaknesses in his camp. He tries to avoid any weaknesses, but of course, Ulf knows everything. He's a universal player, and he saw that actually c4 is a very strong move here. White deliberately goes for the IQP structure because they know that time is on their side. Black is not yet fully developed here. So after d takes c4, knight takes c4, you can see that already the move d5 is in the air. And this would mean, of course, no weaknesses anymore, and white would open up the game for their bishop. So that was a very good decision here. Queen c7 was played in the game. We could have played d5, but Ulf, again, acts in a very flexible way. Rook c1, all the friends to the party, and only after knight e7 he pushed d5, and now already white has a very nice advantage. You can see that if c takes d5, white has many discovered attacks with the knight. Sorry, which do you think would be the strongest one? You're right, knight e5 is a very good move, because after queen d6 we are all the time looking at knight takes d7, but it's actually stronger to take on g6. The point being that if black takes back, then we can take on d5, and we have a double threat here. Bishop takes f7 and bishop takes b7. So difficult position for black here after d5. In the game they played rook ad8, and you can of course guess what Ulf played here, right? Of course. Chess engines might have other preferences, but human-wise, this has to be a good move. Passed pawn on the 6th rank. That's already good news for us. Queen b8, queen b3 was played by white, bringing the last piece to the action. You can see that now we have rook e7 coming up. The pawn on b7 is starting to feel a little uncomfortable. Bishop f5 was played in the game after rook e7. White had a clear advantage, and they later prevailed in this game. So what I wanted to show you here, simply this kind of thinking now. They are all about to take this pawn. This is the threat. We can defend it in a million ways here. We can play rook b1, we can play b3, we can play queen c1, but we don't want that. We want to play something more refined, something more powerful. And that is where the move rook e3 comes in, because apart from the fact that it's enabling this tactical idea, it's also a way for white to fight for the open file, right? It's a useful move, rook e3. Strategically, it's a useful move. So that's why it's such a nice move. We're like combining strategy and tactics in one single move. All right, let's continue. Our next example, I would say it's more complex. We have a battle here, typical Catalan battle, with the white pieces, Nizhnik, and playing black, Justice Williams. Black has just played queen b6. The queen was under an attack from the rook, and as you can see now, it's black who's threatening something. Bishop takes f2. So what do you think? How should we deal with the threat of bishop takes f2? Which would be the best way of safeguarding that pawn? Actually, none. We won't safeguard that pawn. Because if black takes this pawn, we go king g2, there will be some tactical liabilities for black. We are familiar from chapter 3, this kind of thinking. We can go for a counter threat instead and let them take that if they like. So which counter threat do you think we're considering here? Aha, white played at this point the move a3. So I looked quite for a while at this example and trying to understand it because it's rather complex. But my way of understanding this is that the most obvious move here for white would be knight e4. We would then defend a pawn, we would attack another pawn, and we would have the trade on c5 in the pocket whenever we like. So how could such a natural move possibly not be the best choice? Well, as I understand it, what Nizhnik didn't like here is that black would play knight e5. And the knight, black's knight, I mean, is very strong in the center. It's keeping control of the position. And it wouldn't be that easy for white to get an advantage. Maybe black could play later on f5 at some point. Perhaps they could even castle once they have eliminated this knight or pushed it away. So I think that's why he didn't like the move knight e4. He didn't want to let black's knight reach the square d5, because I think we can agree that black's knight is in a weird position, no? It's not really doing anything on b4. It's not so well placed. It would have been better off on, let's say, for example, e7. So that's why he played here a3. So you have to do some calculation here. Now you can see that knight e5, we will, of course, just take it, and we will ruin their pawn structure. So black played bishop takes f2. There followed king g2, and as you can see, now black has like two liabilities here. The bishop is a little exposed, and the knight, of course, they have to move it. So if knight c6, now the knight has been pushed away from that natural destiny on d5, so now white will play knight e4. As you can see now, there are several threats here, right? We're attacking the bishop, we're creating the threat of a fork on d6, and also the pawn on f6 is hanging. So this would be very troublesome for black, this position. So after king g2, black played instead knight d5, but that's not what they wanted, of course, because now their pawn structure is ruined. No? Of course, we could argue that they shouldn't have played this, that they should have played after the move a3. You could say, okay, why do they take if it's so dangerous? Why don't they just retreat the knight? But here you can see this would let white play knight e4, and now there is not the move knight d5 anymore. So something like bishop e7, and I think here there is a good queen move with white. So if you're playing white, where would you put the queen? Yeah, I wasn't referring to queen d3, because then maybe black would just play rook d8. There is this very nice move. Aha. Prophylactic thinking. We play queen c1 because we know that if they castle, then they drop this pawn on h6. Since black's rook on c8 is undefended, there are no real discovered attacks with the knight, right? And apart from that, what white would like to do here, they would like to bring the queen to f4 in order to attack black's king, which is in the center. So that would not be an easy solution either for black. So no matter how you react here, it's actually quite troublesome for black, this position. But you have to see this move a3, or you have to understand that it's good for you. So that's definitely high-level tactical play here by Nizhnik. All right, let's see the game very quickly. Bishop takes f2. Check, king g2, and after knight d5, white, of course, hurry to take on d5 to ruin black's pawn structure. After e takes d5, you and me were expecting rook takes d5, but look what Nizhnik played. Fantastic, e4, brilliant move in my opinion. You could have taken on d5, but probably he noticed that black would then castle, and despite this ugly pawn structure, it's still not completely clear how to decide this with white. There would be this move bishop e3, protecting the pawn. But look at the move that he played here, e4. We're trying to open up the game, and we're also thinking about installing a passed pawn. Yeah, that's very, very clever. So black should have castled, and after e takes d5, white would have a very nice advantage here. You can easily see that comparing with the other position that we talked about. We talked about this position, right, with the pawn on e2. This is a different story. White's pawn structure is not that great. But here you can see that we have a fantastic passed pawn. So white will have big advantage here in this position. In the game after e4, Williams instead played d takes e4. And here, white simply took back on e4, queen takes e4 check, and after king f8, I think you can guess white's next move here in the game, right? Definitely, we should go for an attack now. Rook d7, such moves, they come automatically. We have the threat of queen e7, black hurry to play here rook e8, white play queen d5, resuming the threat of mate. Black tried rook e6, and as we are discussing, I think several times already in this course, it's important to use all our pieces. The last friend to the party, so to speak, you got it. We should include the rook in our attack also. So rook c1, very good move. You can see that the rook is aiming at the c7 square. Black played king g7 after rook c7, cc7, rook f8. You can guess here the next move, of course. But white played, we should target the pawn on f7. There is one angle left for that. Queen h5, and black resigned, unable to prevent rook takes f7 next. So yeah, brilliant game in my opinion. Very nice display here, tactical display, or what would you say, tactics and strategy again combined. This move was very clever. Random move here, or what would you say, mechanical move, knight e4, not random, knight e4 or e3. This would be typical moves, but Nizhnik, he delved a little further into the position and understood that it's important to play this move first to see where the knight goes. And only if knight c6, then we would play knight e4. So some kind of smart defense. We are basically ignoring the threat at f2 because we know that in the end, black will end up in tactical difficulties. All right, after this complex example, I think we should move over to something a little more simple. So let's have a look at some cases from the opening phase. All right, let's take a first example here. This is a game between Lok Sin with the white pieces and German Grandmaster Mayer playing black. As you can see, some kind of ready with white. White has just played here queen b3, targeting the pawn on b7. There are many such cases in opening theory where one of the queens goes to b3 or b6, targeting the opponent's pawn on b2, b7. Very often we protect that pawn in some way, but there are some cases where we can actually rely on a smart defense. So that's what happened here. Mayer was not keen on playing a move like b6 or queen c8. He quickly played here smart defense, knight a6. Very nice, because in this way, as you can see, if white takes on b7, they will soon have to give back that pawn. If white takes on b7, you have these two knight moves. Which one do you think would be the strongest one? That's right. It's better to play knight c5. We get back the pawn instantly, relying on this trick, queen b4, knight takes d3, discovered attack against the queen. If you play in the other way, if you play knight b4, in other openings, this is actually very common. In the London with white, for example, there is some line like that where black takes the pawn on b2 and white plays knight b5. But here it's not fully functional. White will play knight a3, and we can actually not trap the queen here. Believe it or not, white's queen could escape in this way. So it's actually better to play, after queen takes b7, it's much better to play knight c5. As you can see, white will lose a pawn here. They will have to go back to b4, and after that we take on d3. If they insist on keeping their extra pawn, then they will lose their queen instead. As you can see, black will hurry to attack the queen. You can guess the next move here. Of course, it's the rook which should carry out that idea. They can try this move bishop f4, targeting the pawn on c7, but we can simply block the bishop, obstruct it by means of bishop d6, and after bishop takes, pawn takes. As you can see, thanks to this great knight, white cannot really save their queen from the upcoming move, rook b6. Nothing of this happened in the game, of course. After knight a6, Lok Sin instead played the much more reasonable move, bishop g5. After that, black simply played c6. You have the same situation again here, I think, with smart defense. If queen takes b7, I think we would just play knight c5 anyway, right? And I think the queen is running into trouble here. Maybe rook b8 straight away and then rook b6. No, I think. Even more. If bishop takes, we could just take with the pawn. I think this is also troublesome for white, right? We have rook b6 coming up next. So it's understandable that white didn't want to enter these complexities. After bishop d5, c6, white simply played knight d2. And here finally Mayer played knight c5 with a perfectly possible game. So important in many different openings. When you have this kind of situation, one of your pawns is targeted, please don't think that the only correct options are to protect the pawn or move it. Please consider also smart defense, like in this case, bringing out the knight, aiming at c5. This comes up in a variety of openings. All right, we will have a look at another example. It's from a Queen's Gambit accepted. You can see that there are no pawns on the D and C files, which is a typical feature of the Queen's Gambit accepted. Black's queen is targeting the bishop on c4. Our first instinct, of course, here would be to protect that bishop. If I play the bullet game, I would probably play here the move queen e2, but it's not the best move. If queen e2, for example, black could simply develop here bishop e7, bishop e2 castles, rook ac1, and as you can see, black's queen finds a nice destiny on h5. I would say in general terms, this square is rather safe when white doesn't have a bishop on e2. So this would be okay for black. But in this game, played between Esipenko with white and Tilyaev with the black pieces, Esipenko found a much smarter move here. Look very carefully and you can see that there is some kind of tactical motive along the c-file, right? The bishop on c8 is undefended since black hasn't yet castled. And that's what Esipenko exploited in this game. He played here the move bishop b2. Very nice. This is a strategical move, you could say. It's a good place for the bishop, taking control of the long diagonal, and also we are enabling rook c1. But specifically speaking here, the point is of course that black cannot take, because in that case we would play rook c1, and if black insists with grabbing material, they will get mated here, right? You got it. Rook takes c8 and it's mate after king e7, queen d8. So as simple as that, bishop e2. It's not really like white is pulling a trap or something by playing bishop e2. They're simply playing the best move in the position. They don't commit the queen. Perhaps the queen has some other function now. And also you can see that rook c1 is coming very quickly. If now black plays, what was my point here? If in some line, if black brings the queen to h5, I was going to say we have bishop e2. Let's see what happened in the game. Black played bishop e7 and, oh, interesting, he actually played bishop d4 here. Yeah, this is a very ambitious move, of course. White hurries to attack the black queen so that there is the threat of knight c7 if the queen moves away from the c-file. Yeah, very, very clever. So at the end here, since queen c6 invites knight e5, black actually had to take on c4. And now you know what happened, of course. Rook c1, black is now losing material. They had to play queen takes c1, queen takes c1, castles. At this point, white has a slight material advantage and the queen is very strong. Esipenko proceeded with bishop c5 in order to weaken black's dark squares. After bishop takes, queen takes, you can see that knight e6 is coming up also. So this is definitely unpleasant for black. After knight c6, knight bd4, white later on prevailed. In this way, they make sure that the b pawn leaves the board. So very nice example, bishop e2, try to think beyond the obvious moves, like for example queen e2 or moving the bishop somewhere. This is much more powerful. We are relying on this tactical trick. Of course, black might have played something different here. I don't know, maybe you could play something like knight a6 maybe and move away the queen, but it will still be unpleasant for black. I'm not sure exactly where to put the queen in that case. Yeah, not easy at all, no, to find a good square for the queen here perhaps, but this still looks very unpleasant for black. Perhaps the move that we talked about, bishop e2, could be interesting here. Yeah, this looks like a nightmare. Black is probably regretting that they didn't castle earlier in this game. So nice opportune play by Esipenko here, bishop b2. Nice little tactical trick. All right, so far I think in all the examples there was a choice. We could play something like routine move like queen e2, or we could play the smart defense with bishop e2. But in our next example, I think there is actually no such choice. I'll show you what this is about. We are playing here with the black pieces. It's an English dragon, kind of reverse dragon with the bishop on g2 in this game between with the white pieces Julio Granda and playing black Wesley So. So what do you think about this pawn on d4? How are we supposed to protect that pawn? Sorry. There is no immediate defense of this pawn. We cannot play c5 because we're hanging the pawn and so on. So how could we possibly safeguard this pawn? We don't want to lose that pawn, our central or proud central pawn. So you really have to be inventive here, or you have to know your opening theory, because actually what Wesley So played here, very nice move, it had actually been played before. This is already within the terrains of modern opening theory. So what do you think? Can you think of some smart way of securing that pawn? I can give you a hint. You have to use the motive of deflection. Deflection is involved in this case in order to safeguard the pawn on d4. There is some kind of dependency here. You can see that if it's white to play, they could not take with this knight, because in that case, black would play a4. So what we should try to do, they would take with this knight, right? So we should try to carry out a similar idea on the opposite flank. So now that you know what this is about, now it's easy to see the move. g5 looks a little unnatural perhaps, but it's very strong. In this way, we get ready to meet knight b takes d4 with g4. We're winning the knight now. And obviously, as we just commented here, if knight f takes d4, we will go a4. Apart from that, actually g5, it's not strategically, it's not a very risky move because we have some control of the king side here. We're ready to play bishop g7, and it's not easy to see how white would capitalize on these supposed weaknesses. So it's actually a way of gaining space also. We could even consider later on to play g4. So interesting way of defending the pawn on d4, some kind of smart defense or maybe tactical tricks. We have a chapter about tactical, how could I say, tricks in the defensive play coming up a little later, by the way. So let's see what happened here in the game. Julio Granda played queen d2 and Wesley So hurried to play here g4. In the other game that I mentioned, they instead played here a4, which also seemed quite promising because again you have the situation with knight b takes d4, g4, black wins piece. So white played instead knight c5 and black simply played here h6 in this game, Markov versus Frolyanov, 1 year earlier than this game. So this was also possible, but in the game Wesley So preferred to play g4. He had a very interesting idea here. After knight h4, he played the move rook e5. Maybe you remember that game Karpov-Hort back in the 80s where Karpov played. I think it was a Sicilian Keres attack, I think. He brought the rook to the 4th rank with white pieces, Anatoly Karpov. So this is something similar, not as dramatic as Karpov's game, but it's still rather nice. So rook e5, black is taking control of the whole 4th rank, and as you can see also they are protecting the pawn on a5. So black is a bit better here, or at least they have the initiative, we could say. Queen f4 was played in the game. Black played here queen d6, protecting the rook and also preparing the move bishop h6. White played e3. There were some tactical complexities here. If white takes on d4, black could take, and as you can see, the knight is protecting the pawn, so we should play c5 to take that pawn next turn. But in the game, white instead played here e3, and black played the move rook b5. Yeah, very complex battle. As you can see, black is interested in taking this pawn. Then they would basically be winning on the queen side, which is by now black's main battlefield here. So it seems that at this point white made a mistake. Stamenkovic analyzed this position in Chess Informant and concluded that queen e4 was the best move here for white, keeping the queens on, perhaps since the king is also a little shaky here. But in the game, unfortunately, Julio Granda took on c7 instead, and after that Wesley So is very happy to trade queens and bring the game into the endgame, since he has an advantage on the queen side here. Queen takes f4, and after e takes f4, a4, as you can see now, finally black will take this pawn. Knight takes d4, rook takes b2. Even if black is down a pawn, you can see that they have a very strong initiative on the queen side. This pawn is very close to queening, so later on black went on to win this game. So interesting example from the English. As you can see, the pawn was in danger. This pawn on d4 was in big danger, but black found a clever way of safeguarding it. g5, some kind of funny symmetry with the pawns hunting the knights or something like that. And also we're preparing fianchetto with bishop g7. Let's have a look at one more opening example. If this one was, what can I say, counterintuitive, just wait until you see the next example. This is from the Caro-Kann, the 2 knights Caro-Kann, I think. Black has just played knight b4. It's easy to see their idea. They are attacking the pawn on c2. So since this is the chapter about smart defense, you already know that you should not play some routinary move like knight d3 or bishop d3 or something like that. That's for cowards, you would say. I'm just joking. Of course, we have to analyze every opportunity and compare them. So knight takes g6 has been played in the past. In this way, white eliminates this threat, but on the other hand, they lose the target that they have here. The bishop on g6, the Caro-Kann bishop, is always something that white can try to attack in several Caro-Kann lines. So this had been played before, but it's not really that promising. Black has a typical Caro-Kann game here. They don't have any big problems, but there is a much stronger move here. And this is actually part of opening theory. So what white can do here, since we have this thing going on with the bishop being subject to an attack, we can try to play h5 at the right moment, but we shouldn't play it here, because I think in that case black wouldn't take like that, because then we have king d2. Instead, I think black would take with the bishop on c2. This would probably be more annoying. Although actually, to be very honest, I would have to look into this, because it looks interesting also for white, don't you think? Queen f3 maybe, attacking the pawn on f7. Maybe black would have to play f6 in that case. Yeah, probably black is okay in this position. That's what I would think, at least. So let's have a look at what happened in the game. By the way, with the white pieces, Andrei Ostrovsky, and playing black is Mark Velashvili. Georgian Grandmaster. And I think that the Georgian Grandmaster was not prepared for this, because after the move a3, this is what they played in the game. After this move, actually, he lost his way very quickly here. What's the point of this move a3? Well, we are deliberately inviting them to take the pawn on c2. Just the move that they were about to play, we actually let them play it. That's really surprising. But as I was saying, this is part of opening theory. You can see that bishop takes e2 now is impossible, because after queen d2, the topic of deflection, the bishop is now doomed on c2. So in the game, Ostrovsky instead, Margvelashvili instead took on c2 with a knight. And after king d2, yeah, probably you wouldn't play this if you were not prepared, right? One thing that we should notice here is also black's weakness on the a4, e8 diagonal, another typical feature of the Caro-Kann. So if knight takes d4, you can see that white would have queen a4. This is very unpleasant for black, because yeah, they are going down here. Knight c6 we can just take, and as you can see, this is terminal for black. So they can't really play like that. If they take on a1, you can guess what white will play. Yeah, we just talked about it. The vulnerability on the a4, e8 diagonal, white will play queen a4, and if b5, they won't think twice about taking on b5 also. Aha, completely punishing black on this diagonal a4, e8. So after king d2, the best move probably is here to play rook c8. This had been played in the past in an old game, Komlyakov with white and Rogozhenko with the black pieces. This was played. Knight takes d6, knight takes a1. Funny complications here. Knight takes h8. Both knights are now in the opposite corner. Queen b6. White now has a serious material advantage, but their king is not optimally placed on d2. After queen a4, this is what Komlyakov played. Rook c6, king d1, white later on prevailed. I think they have an extra piece, but okay, things are not so clear here. What happened in the game instead was simply that after king d2, black played e6, but this is basically like resigning the theoretical battle at least. So white could have played h5, but in the game, Ostrovsky was very practical. He just took on g6, as you can see now. If knight takes, this is not the same thing as last time. I think we would just play knight takes h8. This is much better than the other line, right? Yeah, because the rook is not here and the pawn is still on the board. I'm just trying to understand what would be the difference here with the other line. Oh yeah, rook c8 is in and the pawn is, that might have some kind of difference. Aha. All right, so yeah, this is probably also bad for black. I was curious as for this check on a4, but it's probably not. Does that make a difference? It does make a difference, right? Yeah, there is always a difference. Aha, I think the difference with the rook on a8 is that actually here we could go queen a4. But that looks interesting, yeah, because now at b5 we will play knight takes b5, right? Yeah, you can see the point here. But black could not play queen d7. They would like to play this move, but then white would play bishop b5, exploiting the pin along the a file. So for that reason, I think in the other variation, yeah, in the other variation, we don't have this, right? In the other variation, after rook c8, instead like Rogozhenko played, I think it's different, because here after knight takes g6, knight takes a1, now this is not such a big threat anymore, right? We could probably now play queen d7. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is not so good for white, because also here, if they trade queens, for example, this will let black later on perhaps rescue the knight in this way. Well, nothing is clear in this position, but I'm just giving you some ideas about how I understand this. So after king d2, e6, white played in the game knight takes c6, and after h takes c6, if black had played here knight takes a1, it's my theory that queen a4 will be killing here, because they can't play b5 due to knight takes b5, if you see what I mean. A takes b5, bishop takes b5, as you can see, black's king is in huge danger here. So yeah, that probably explains why in the game black instead after knight takes g6 simply took back on h6, and as I was saying, they are simply resigning here the theoretical battle, because white just takes on c2 and they have an extra piece for one pawn, right? They got one pawn here, rook takes h4, but after rook takes, queen takes, bishop e3, white was much better, and they went on to win here after knight f6, bishop e2. Sometimes 2 pawns can be quite a lot for a piece, but not here exactly, because we don't have, for example, if black would have two connected pawns in the center or something like that. Passed pawns, that's a different story, but here the position is not so dynamic for black. So white is much better here in this position. So what a complex example. I hope you didn't get too confused by this example, but what I wanted to show you is that sometimes we don't really have to care about such an attack as in this case knight takes e2. Sometimes attack is the best defense. This move was very clever because it's hurting black where he's weakest, so to speak. Knight takes e2, king d2. As you can see, the knight is in trouble, the bishop is in trouble, and we even have this very nice tactical idea, mating idea with queen a4 and so on. So yeah, nice little idea in the Caro-Kann play a3 to actually invoke this move, knight takes c2. A little similar to what Chan did in the game that we saw where he played a6, invoking white to take on d6. Some kind of similar way of thinking. All right, after so much opening play, let's have a look at two endgames also. This game is actually familiar to us. Puranik with white, Arkel with the black pieces. We came across this endgame in the chapter about counter threats, I think. No, about intermediate moves. Yeah, we concluded that Arkel with the black pieces could have saved the game with the intermediate check with a rook, if you remember. I think it was something like rook g3 check or something like that. That's the same endgame, by the way. So let's have a look at what's going on here. We have an endgame where material is equal, but white seems to have the better of it because their pawn structure is sounder. You can see that they actually have a passed pawn on c4. If they could get rid of that knight, they would have a big advantage. But black is putting up resistance. You can see that the pawn on e5 is in the air. So what do you think? Should we, with the white pieces, should we protect this pawn on e5 or should we rely on some kind of smart defense? That's right. Since you know which chapter is involved, it's easy to presume that we should actually look for a smart defense. And that's what Puranik did in the game. If he protects the pawn, yeah, with the rook, we should probably not protect it now because there is knight e3. So we would have to play king f4. But in that case, it would be not so easy for white to progress here, right? Because the king is like cut off. The king would like to get closer to the center. In the ideal world, the king would be a little more up on the board to help the c-pawn to advance. That's probably what white is aiming for here. So for that reason, Puranik resorted to a smart defense here. He played the move king e3. Very simple, but very clever. No, you can see the point. If rook takes e5, we can use our king for a fork. King d4 forks the knight and the rook. Black will have to play knight e7. This means that they are still in the battle because they are not losing material. If bishop c6, black could play rook e5. On the other hand, black's pieces are now not in optimal places, and white has a smart way of improving their rook. So what would you play in order to improve the rook? Leaving aside the move c5, which looks very tempting also, but I think there is an even better move. Aha, you're right. It's time to improve this rook. Earlier, this move was not so good, perhaps due to knight b3, but now we can duly attack the pawn on a5, we'll attack the pawn on a7, and yeah, as you can see, we have a second passed pawn, so this must be very promising for white. So in the game, after king e3, Arkel played knight b3 instead, declining white's offer, so to speak. And Puranik continued with king e4, safeguarding the pawn in the best possible way. You can see that if black tries to repeat moves, white has no intention of repeating moves. They would play king d4, and after knight b3, king c3. After knight c5, we should look for a counter threat here. So what do you think? Instead of defending this pawn, how could we go for a counterattack? You got it. Rook f1. That's a very strong move because we're targeting the pawn on f7. We could take it either with the bishop or with the rook. And if they defend it, we can swing over the rook to the queen side here. Exactly. Rook f6, very strong move with a point rook c6. Our basic plan here is, like we were discussing, to push the c pawn. So that's the highest priority here, to bring the rook to c6 in this case would greatly help our main plan here. So king e4 was played in the game. Black didn't try to repeat moves. They played king g7 instead. At this point, Puranik played rook e1 and later on prevailed, but an even stronger move would have been here the move bishop c6. In this way, we're actually clearing some space for our king. Well, depending on what black plays, of course. But if they keep the rook on the second rank in order to safeguard the pawn on a7 and so on, preventing rook d7. Now this would actually give us a chance to bring in our king in active king fashion, king d5. And as you can see here, the king is coming closer. We are ready to play c5 and so on. We have the magic distance with the knight. We can't get checked very easily here. I would even dare to say that white could look for something like rook d3 or maybe bishop a4, trying to trap this knight, because suddenly it doesn't have so many squares available. So this would have been a very strong option for white. After king g7, they could have played this move, bishop c6, in order to bring in the king or in order to bring in the rook. Well, not at this moment, of course, due to knight c5, but we could do that a little later. We could first see where black's rook would go. Maybe they would put the rook on c8. In that case, I think, yeah, we should not play rook king d5, of course, due to rook d8 check. But I think we could play something like knight b5 maybe. And later perhaps bring in the rook, and we will have quite some activity. Oh, I'm again about to run into this fork. So yeah, don't do that. You can start with rook d6, and maybe then we will have to adjust our plans. Maybe we can move the king somewhere, and after that we can play rook e6. But okay, we will go step by step. There is no rush in this position. The important thing is that we have activity. Our king is in the center and so on. So nice thinking here by Poranik in this example. No need to protect this pawn in a mechanic way with king f4 or rook e1. We can rely on smart defense by playing king e3 instead, so that rook takes e5 is met by king d4, and after that black is in tactical difficulties here. The move c5 looks interesting, but there is also the move rook a1, perhaps even stronger. Very clever idea by the Indian Grandmaster. All right, we have arrived at our last example. This is also from the endgame, but in a more defensive context, you could say. We are playing with the white pieces here in this game, Mayorov with white and Kulouts with the black pieces. Black has just played here the move queen f5. You can see that they are targeting our pawn on h3. So what do you think? What should we do about that pawn? There are a bunch of different ways of protecting that pawn. This looks a little like the first example that we looked at, the Li Ruifeng versus Sevian example, where the pawn on h6 in Sevian's camp was attacked. So you can defend it in different ways. You can put the bishop here. You can, well, actually not so many ways. No, you cannot play king h2 because the pawn is hanging. So you don't have many ways to defend it. And if you move it, there is also a problem, right? So what do you think? What to do? Perhaps we could just ignore it. You're right. We can ignore this threat, but of course we have to prepare something else for that to work out. Else they will take on h3 and they are basically mating us. So let's go here step by step. If we play bishop f1, the mechanic defense, we actually run into huge trouble here, because black will then play knight e4. A very strong move, threatening to take on f2, and if white takes on e4, they will take back. And this is a very powerful battery. So this must definitely be avoided. On the other hand, if we move the pawn that was attacked, black could react in exactly the same way. They could also consider queen h3, but even stronger it seems, knight e4, and as you can see, there is the threat of queen takes f2, and again we have the very unpleasant situation with black's battery ready to give mate. What is that the best move? Well, I'll give you a hint. Look at the whole board, please. Try to look away from this side and look for opportunities on other parts of the board. Another hint for you might be that if black to play takes on h3, it would be very nice to play the move e4. So if you want to prepare e4, which piece could be used for that purpose? What do you think? Aha, you're right. This is the move that Mayorov played in the game also. Queen a4. It's not some strange computer move, it's what the human played in the game. Queen a4, we are targeting the pawn on a7, but more importantly, we are ready to meet queen takes h3 with e4. And suddenly it turns out that actually black's situation is difficult. The bishop is in danger here. As you can see, if the bishop goes down, we can take on a7, and they have tactical difficulties here. If they take on e4, as you can see, we have a cheap tactic. Knight takes, and queen a8, picking up the knight on e4, sorry. So not so easy for black, this situation. After e4 in the game, instead, Kulouts shied away from this capture on h3. He played instead the move queen e5. In this way, as you can see, he's targeting the pawn on b2, and he's keeping track of this very important square on e4, making it impossible for white to go e4. So at this point, there was no more smart defense available, white simply relied on the normal defense here. They played here queen c2 because black doesn't have any additional threats here really. Black played in the game bishop e7. They were perhaps hoping to play at some point queen d5, not now perhaps, but later. In any case, white played a clever move here, bishop f3, trading off that strong bishop, and after that, as you can see, white's problems are basically over. There are no mating attacks and things like that to worry about anymore, and perhaps in the further course of the game, the pawn on c5 might even be slight weakness. In any case, that's what happened in the game. It was later draw this game, but important to see this move queen a4. I actually don't think there is any other move, so this is another of those cases where actually smart defense is our only choice. We couldn't safeguard this pawn in any good way. I think also queen f1 would be ugly, no, because the queen was very active on, well, not that active, but it's even worse now, right, on f1. Maybe they can go like queen c2, targeting this pawn and so on. So, or the same knight e4 possibly. So, yeah, very important move here, queen a4, key move. Getting ready to take the pawn, but more importantly, to play e4 if black takes the pawn on h3. All right, so we have seen quite a number of interesting cases where smart defense helped the defender's task. Let's do a very fast recap here. We start with the first example. Sevjan retreated the knight to e7 to be ready to meet bishop takes h6 with knight f5. In the next example, Sargsyan played queen d5 so that knight takes f5 would fail to knight takes d2, exploiting the discovered attack. We saw in the next example how Rojas played this very surprising move, knight e8, so that after rook takes e4 he would be ready to play knight takes d6, actually getting back the material at once, since if white moves the rook in a horizontal way, black's pawns would be ready to deflect the rook from the defense of the bishop on c4. We had a look at this game Onyshuk-Chan, where Chan played here a6, since he knew that if white takes on d6, then there is a problem along the d file, using pins, so to speak. We're back in chapter 8, right? We saw Ulf Andersson playing this very opportune move, rook e3, smart defense of the b2 pawn. Black can definitely not take there, because in that case we take and we trap the queen on b3. In our next example, I would say this is the most complex of all, a3. What a clever way of thinking. Nizhnik wanted black to declare where they would put the knight, and only then white would consider to play knight e4. So bishop takes f2, king g2, and black had tactical difficulties. Very clever move a3 instead of the routine move knight e4. We saw some opening cases here. Mayer played knight a6, knowing that if white takes on b7 there is knight c5, and suddenly white's queen is in some trouble. They would have to go back with the queen, but after that we are very happy to take back the pawn, and we would have the bishop pair after taking on c1. We saw in the Esipenko example that the bishop on c4 could be defended in an indirect way by playing bishop b2, in the sense that queen takes c4 would be met by rook c1, targeting the bishop on c8. We said that this gave white more flexibility. We don't waste the move on queen e2, for example. We played a much more useful move, bishop b2. We saw in the game Granda saw how So pushed the pawn g5 so that he could meet both knight captures with a pawn move, which would deflect the knight from the defense of the other knight. Then we saw in this complex Caro-Kann example a3, not exactly the first move that you would expect. It even looks like some kind of blunder, but it's actually a very strong move, because white has understood that taking on c2 does more harm than good for black. After king d2 there are multiple tactical difficulties for black. Only one is the situation with the king on the a4 e8 diagonal. We saw a few endgame examples. King e3 was Puranik's move here in order to meet rook takes e5 with king d4. Clever thinking in the endgame. And finally this defensive example where white played queen a4 so that they would meet queen takes h3 with e4, after which actually black's bishop would be in quite some difficulties. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.